Climate change impacts are accelerating that loss, including warming waters, coastal erosion, and ocean acidification. So with the decline of the biological resource, we're also in danger of losing the connections to the past through living cultures and living heritage. Excuse me. Another species that's been culturally important for millennia is the cedar of Lebanon, whose remnant forests are on the World Heritage List in Lebanon. The cedars are part of an associative cultural landscape connected to the sacred and commercial importance of the tree in antiquity and the development of Christianity in the region. And as you can see, the iconic cedar is on the flag, it's on the coins, it's on the stamps. I mean, it's part of everyday life in the region today. Cedars were culturally and commercially important for building and shipbuilding for over 4,500 years. And the Phoenicians were trading Lebanese cedar to the timber-poor Egyptians from the 3rd millennium BC for building and for the coffins of the elite. This 8th century Assyrian relief is thought to depict the transport of cedar logs. And Lebanon cedars are mentioned more than 100 times in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. So there's a direct connection through thousands of years. Deforestation was already a problem by the time Emperor Hadrian placed forest boundary markers to keep people out of the forest and away from the timber. So it was already something that was highly valued and people were being prevented for taking at that time. Today there are just 12 small and fragmented refugial cedar forests in Lebanon. And climate projections show that the cold-loving trees will likely be lost from most of those sites, at least at the forest level, due to warming temperatures and drier conditions by the end of the century. And that severs the connection to the past, if it were to happen. Now I'm going to move back to the US, to Acadia National Park in Maine, in the northeast of the US. This is a landscape where indigenous people have harvested a wetland perennial grass called sweetgrass, which is used in other parts of the US too, for millennia, for basket making and other uses, including ceremonial uses. However, with the creation of the national park, they were prohibited for almost a century from gathering sweetgrass in the national park. It grows in the coastal transitional zone, and the indigenous people know where the best places to harvest it are, but they were not allowed into the national park. And recently, as the sweetgrass beds became less viable and less healthy, the park managers looked for ways to improve the health, and they started working with local indigenous people and allowing harvesting into the park. And it's a big, long, complex story that I won't tell, but they said, well, let's test out this area, and the local people said, well, that's not where we want to harvest our grass, right? So at the end of this project, the sweetgrass beds have become much more healthy, and the indigenous local people are able to harvest again. And so this has become a collaborative effort to try to improve the health of that ecosystem. The Park Service, the US Park Service, has also been collaborating with Bonnie Newsom. She's a member of the indigenous Penobscot Nation and an archaeologist at the University of Maine. And I think we heard for calls this morning, a change to indigenous archaeology, a decolonizing archaeology. Bonnie is one of the people at the forefront of that kind of work. Maine has at least 2,000 coastal shell-bearing sites, including mounds, middens, and heaps, representing at least 5,000 years of indigenous families living on the coastal zone. Climate impacts on the mounds include sea level rise, changed freeze-thaw cycles, and coastal erosion. And when some of the mounds were first excavated in the 1970s and 80s, sort of not surprisingly, but unfortunately, it was done without the input of any indigenous descendants, and since then they didn't even have access to the artifacts in the archives. So oral narratives, intergenerational memories, and indigenous knowledge were not used to interpret materials or context. Dr. Newman has brought indigenous perspectives to bear on archaeological narratives. She's organized field visits with tribal members and convened workshops that enabled them to look at the archaeological material from their own cultural perspectives of language, experience and in the context of learning through their ancestors. And the workshops also came up with proposals for culturally appropriate site management to ameliorate climate impacts and raise awareness of Wabanaki history. And finally on this topic, and you'll be happy to hear almost finally, I'd like to highlight a piece of work from the indigenous Anishinaabe tribes of the ceded territories of the Great Lakes region of the USA. Their Great Lakes Climate Vulnerability Assessment, entirely undertaken by indigenous people, combines traditional ecological knowledge and the most up-to-date climate science, but approaches with a holistic worldview that sees humans as just one part of nature and all other beings as non-human relatives. So the indigenous researchers assessed the vulnerability of 66 culturally important species of animals and plants that were identified by tribal communities through interviews and discussions in the region. And here we see the results for plants, showing the ones at the top in red, the species at greatest risk. Unfortunately, the plant at greatest risk is wild rice, known as manoomin, and that is the most culturally important plant to the people in this region. And as one elder said when interviewed, there is no origin story for wild rice. It's elemental, it was there from the beginning, it's like the original berry, it always existed. It's its own spirit, and everything flows from that. And I mean, I find that emotional to read, because what we're seeing here is climate change, which is striking at the history, at the identity, at the culture of people. So where do we go from here? I think we're going to have a week of discussions, so I'm not going to go on much with recommendations, but a few things that in my work over the last 10 or 15 years on this sort of cultural heritage and climate change area seem to me to be not happening and to be important. So in the key international processes, 5 suggestions, or maybe it's 4 suggestions. We need to see, as I said earlier, more heritage expertise in the IPCC's next report, and that's the 7th assessment report cycle, which is just starting. I think we need to radically strengthen climate impact reporting in World Heritage State of Conservation reports and periodic reporting processes, because if you read those every year, they're extremely variable in how climate change is talked about or whether it's talked about at all. I'd like to see us requiring, or the World Heritage Committee, requiring at least basic climate vulnerability assessments for new World Heritage nominations. It very seldom comes, sometimes it does, but it's very rare that there's any kind of vulnerability assessment for climate in a new nomination, partly because states want to see their sites get through, so they don't want necessarily to say, well, this is going to go under the water in 10 years' time. And then increasing a focus, as we've already said, across all processes on indigenous knowledge, intangible cultural heritage, and non-economic loss and damage. And finally, what are some of the priorities if you're a manager in climate heritage management? How do you deal with climate change? Well, integrate climate change into all the planning processes. Use the best available climate science, and in the global south in particular, that's going to require more support and resources to enable people to access up-to-date climate science. Understand and assess climate risk and vulnerability, and we're going to hear more about that from some of our speakers tomorrow. Recognize that climate doesn't act on its own. It's a factor along with other risk factors, and so you have to look at how they might exacerbate each other, how they compound together. And in planning, embrace uncertainty. Look at scenarios, plan for the most plausible scenarios, but don't assume that what you think is going to happen today is definitely what's going to happen. And I think the next speaker, Abdul Latif, is going to talk a little bit about that in a specific site. And then finally, develop strategies for climate education and interpretation at sites. And I know that Will and others may talk about that tomorrow, but so often we go to sites that are impacted by climate change and we don't see any signage or any information about those climate impacts. impacts. Perhaps a rare something different is some of the glaciers in North America. The US National Park Service has shown you where the glacier used to be 5 or 10 years ago, and so you can see the change on the ground, but signage is just not there. So that's all I have for today, and I will be happy to get off the podium and allow Abdul Latif the cherished end of the evening spot.
I think that's my phone.
Oh, that's your phone.
Because I've lost it.
Okay. Nice to meet you.
So thank you, Adam, for that very sobering summary of the situation, the climate change globally. And we'll shift now more to a very more specific case in Qatar. So in my request to Abdul Latif to ask him for a biography to speak, he said just keep it very simple. So he's an all-round good guy. That's it. No, come on. He is the Director of the Cultural Heritage Protection at Qatar Museums, the Manager of the Qatar National Cultural Heritage Law. He oversees site management, heritage activation, adaptive reuse, and the movement of cultural property, as well as emergency response planning. So welcome back. Sorry, I did forget to say that because today we were running so far behind, we've decided to not have the commentary and questions after the two keynotes, and that if you do want to ask them very specific questions, again, there will be pisco sour tonight at the back there if you want to have a chat to them, okay?
You know, I realize I'm the only thing standing between you and dinner right now, so I apologize in advance. Essentially what we're talking about right now is downstream from what my colleague, my new friend, Adam has talked about, is how to embrace change, how to not wait for the disaster to happen, how to take action based on what you have on site, understand the vulnerabilities and complexities, and try to actually take an action that matters, that makes a difference, that impacts the community, that involves all of the stakeholders. So here's an example. In Qatar, we have a site called Al Sabara. It's a World Heritage Site. It's Qatar's only World Heritage Site. It's also Qatar's largest archaeological site, over 60 hectares of land. As a settlement, it's coastal in northwest Qatar, inscribed to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2013. But as a site itself, it includes very variant components. So you have the main city, which at its peak had around 14,000 residents for Qatar of that time, a settlement that was established around 1760. That was quite large. It was an important global port. Basically, the decline of Basra in Iraq was the climb of Al Zabara. It just kind of stepped in to replace it. The site includes salt flats. It's a very desert environment, very coastal environment, very high temperature environment, very high salinity soil. But it also has a fort from 1938, as well as a settlement that kind of splits the two dates. A few fish traps, some of them are still quite active. But as a whole, we think the site is still quite complex. You see, because of its sheer size, the buffer is quite expensive. You're looking at massive coastline, you're looking at several fish traps, you're looking at public art installations, settlements that date to the early 1900s in the immediate vicinity of the site. So when you're talking about managing, you have to consider everything that goes with it. It is a remote area. but it's still quite an active site. And you can imagine, as a World Heritage Site, tourists would frequent that area. The local residents of the area still kind of exploit the site as it is right now. An archaeological site, a not very well preserved site prior to inscription, a coastal site in a hot environment that is surrounded by culture. And if that is not enough, it's in a UNESCO biosphere. By show of hands, how many of you know the difference between a biosphere and a national park? That is actually quite expected. When it comes to national parks, you're looking at the beauty of nature. You want to preserve what is naturally existing in nature, or that whatever is considered indigenous to the land. When it comes to biospheres, you need to strike the balance between what's happening now, what's happening with heritage, and what's happening with nature. And you cannot kind of provide any favoritism to any specific part of the site. I don't know if this thing has a pointer. I don't think it does. But within that biosphere, the very top tip of that biosphere, that's the site we were talking about. So it's inside the biosphere, and it's inside the core zone of the biosphere. So whatever you do on site is automatically affecting what's happening in the biosphere. As far as the state goes, yes, Qatar is a very small country, but within that confined space, there are over 9,300 sites between built heritage, archaeological heritage, sites where fossils were discovered. As you can see from the map, the vast majority of it is in North Qatar, and the vast majority of it is in Northwest Qatar. So it's actually directly adjacent to the World Heritage Site. So you have a complex site, cultural in nature, inscribed under international supervision, coastal, impacted by heat, impacted by soilization, by salinity, surrounded by public art, surrounded by biosphere, surrounded by thousands of other heritage sites. So how do you manage? How do you improve? How do you work on identifying the vulnerabilities on such a site? Moving slightly outside the site, if you look at the key or the significant settlements or key archaeological sites, you'll notice that the vast majority of them are also coastal. So whatever is impacting Azawara can be scaled to kind of apply at least across the west coast of Qatar. But if you look at the current profile across the Gulf, the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, you have water coming in from the Indian Ocean. As you can see from the stream, it goes all the way in, and it recirculates at different intervals. The only obstacle that's stopping that current from circling and going out is Qatar. And then if that is not enough, you have the Euphrates and the Tigris coming in from Turkey, from Syria, from Iraq, and then again into the Gulf, and then again flowing across Qatar. So you're dealing with a cross-border sort of a problem that encompasses currents. As far as wind is concerned, you have a predominant wind that flows northwest 11 months out of the year. So far, I seem to be listing just problems, you know. I'm not whining. I'm just breaking down why we got to the project. So the current flows from northwest 11 months out of the year. Whenever it's not flowing from northwest, it's flowing from southeast. So it's kind of along the same axis, impacting the same area. And as a site, you can see that it's kind of shaped like a sea. It's almost like it's a natural catcher. It has a pier or a jetty, a historic one, to the north and to the south. So hand and fingers. It's ready to clamp on anything pretty much that comes to that area. So considering all of that, we basically have an area of vulnerability, inherent vulnerabilities as well as vulnerabilities related to management. You have stakeholders involved, you have a biosphere involved, you have flora and fauna, and you have active fish traps that are still being used by the local community. Immediately in the vicinity, you have high traffic of both local and international tourism, and you start thinking, I need to be proactive. I can't wait for loss. I can't wait for a disaster to happen. Obviously, there are a lot of factors to consider, but after much study, we felt like the 4 key areas that could represent an immediate danger, an immediate risk to the site are the storm surge that is happening in the area. I was just talking right before the presentation that wind profile in some of our previous projects that were done 15 years ago list wind speed, average annual wind speed at 25 knots. For the past 7 years, we're averaging 45 plus. That's almost double. As far as accumulation, if you look at the current coming in from the Indian Ocean, currents coming in from the delta of the rivers, kind of dropping into the Gulf, the large number of vessels, both trades, oil and gas, shipping, transport, local residents kind of living off of sea life, even cruise ships and personal yachts, you have massive amounts of either oil spills or trash. They're just swimming all over the Gulf. And then the last one we have is the issue that the entire coast, the entire western coast of Qatar, it tends to be quite shallow. Usually when you have a coastline, a shoreline that is opposite current, it tends to be actually quite rough, quite deep. But because it's mostly sandy, what ends up happening is it's quite flat, and it drags sand into the Gulf, and it makes for a very shallow beachfront. We started thinking about what kind of vulnerabilities these create for the site itself. So the closest elements within the archaeological site are only about 2 to 3 meters from the sea. These elements have no natural barrier. They're exposed to wind. They're exposed to high temperature. They're exposed to very wet, what we call sabka, or wet, high salinity soil. Some of the build material, I think we heard it in one of the earlier presentations today, that these buildings are made with coral stone, with mud brick. They're quite vulnerable. There is no way these would survive against waves. And at the moment, we are literally inches from water when it comes to storm surge. And then what comes with all of that wind and with all of that high waves, high current, is obviously marine waste. I try not to use some of the more graphic pictures, but essentially you're looking at plastic coming in, bottles, oil spills, carcasses, dead dugongs, seals, half-eaten fish, dead seaweed, creatures or organisms caught in half-broken nets, floating carriers, sometimes drink bottles, water bottles, beer bottles, light cans, water containers, ice containers. And aside from the fact that these are really bad for the site and bad for the environment, being stuck across the beach mean 2 things. They will float back into the water. So whatever marine life kind of exists in the bay around that sea shape are automatically impacted, so they will either leave or be hurt by the fact that these exist. But as a visitor, you yourself, you're in a World Heritage Site, and this is the site that you see. What is the likelihood of you coming back? We've taken a 2-day tour. What is the likelihood of any of those sites having these amounts of deposit? And you're traveling, you're getting on an airplane, or at least locally in a car and driving for a couple of hours to go and see this at your site, at a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So essentially, it was exhausting to manage. You know, to get rid of all of this requires environmental specialists, it requires archaeologists, it required transportation company, specific tools. The entire beach of Zabara is about 2 kilometers long. So with all of these deposits, you need a massive campaign. The least you could do is at least 100 volunteers. In most cases, 200 to 400 people have to be involved, just to kind of get rid of this. Now, with every campaign, with every cleanup campaign, you have to remember that in an archaeological site, you cannot use heavy machinery. You cannot have anything that has vibration. And a lot of these people are not going to be trained. They're going to be people who are willing to work, either paid or unpaid, but they could actually mistakenly pick up shards. They could step over archaeological remains and cause damage. So basically, every campaign, I'm nervous. I don't know if we're losing, I don't know if we lost something in some of those beach cleanups. They could mistaken a piece of plastic or a piece of shard unglazed to a stone. We don't know. We don't know if we lost something due to that campaign. So you end up with massive campaigns that make everybody nervous for the entire weekend, and then a week away, it looks exactly like that. All of the efforts are basically wasted. So trying to rally the community, the local community, to participate. After 2 or 3 or 5 campaigns, they lose enthusiasm. They don't want to be involved. And then on top of that, I just mentioned that the water kind of drags sand back into the Gulf, and it creates roughly about 200 meters of very shallow lands. Why do you think that matters? Why is it an issue that we have very shallow beachfront? What happens in a shallow beachfront that has waste? Number one, the plastic that is accumulated is going to dry up. So it's going to start either becoming really light and be blown away by a 45 knot wind, or it's going to break down where it is and it's going to go back into the ocean as microplastics, or at least chips of plastic. So anything that is living in the bay is consuming whatever is there, and anything that is not broken down and is blown over by the wind, it ends up here. So all of these sites start experiencing plastic. It goes into every crevice, every cranny, every hole, every wall that is kind of standing up against the wind will have an accumulation. So you either have to act fast at Zabara, or you're going to end up cleaning all of this. And the risk of loss becomes exponentially higher. So we went back. These are the key areas that we thought would impact the site the most. As an immediate solution, we felt that storm surge and trying to deal with the change in wind speed is a big problem. Dealing with the marine waste that is impacting both archaeological site and flora and fauna and marine life within a biosphere is a big ticket. And then trying to deal with the issue of all of the waste that is going into other archaeological sites. We also heard about the solution of mangroves. I think it's kind of a universal solution that many kind of tend to exploit to have a mangrove plantation, a mangrove growth. This is actually another site in Qatar where we have exploited mangroves, created for a very positive experience. It's very good for marine life, but we had a couple of issues. We could not use this in Zabara. Number one, you have to know that mangroves are a bit invasive, so they kind of spread, they go around really fast. When you have fish traps, what happens to the fish traps? They become obsolete. So I'm basically taking away a source of food or a source of income from some of the local communities in order to protect the site, a solution that we just basically could not consider. And number two, because of the wetlands, the wet, high salinity lands, there's a chance that the mangroves will actually start surrounding the city and growing behind the city walls, like behind the site, and then essentially isolate it and turn it into an island. And basically that was too high of a risk. Next option that we considered was some sort of a cement barrier. We've looked at a few examples. Essentially, when marine life is not an issue, this could be a very lucrative solution. Problem is, it's very expensive. It's very expensive, requires very high specialized industrial commercial divers, trying to kind of create some work behind the barrier could be an issue. We were worried that the high temperatures would kind of dry out the bay of Zabara. Zabara was a very lucrative port, so there are some underwater archaeology remnants as well. So there are sunken objects, coins. You don't want to impact the bay itself. Again, a solution that works elsewhere, but cannot work for the site. In our studies, we came across something that had nothing to do with storm surge or wind or anything to do with that. It's called a trash boom. Once again, I'm going to ask you, how many of you have heard of a trash boom? Okay. There's a bigger number this time. But how does a trash boom work? It connects to two banks. It has to have some sort of a beginning and an end. It sort of is always against current. It's always concave. It's always shaped as a catcher, sort of like representing the beach of Zabara. But the problem is, these booms are designed to protect oceans from us. So they're placed along rivers. They're placed at maybe lavish beach resorts or water parks, so that whatever pollution that we're doing, whatever plastic, whatever waste we're throwing into the water or we're bringing into the water, does not pollute the rest of the world. But how do you stop waste that is coming in from international waters? How do you find a solution that can somehow use this approach? So we started designing a barrier across the bay. This type of barrier would be 1,500 meters long, 1.5 kilometers in length, but somehow has to not have the net that goes underneath a normal trash boom, because that would stop marine life from going in. It has to respect the fact that the bay has reefs, living reefs. It has to not be invasive. So it has to be something that is not permanent, that is reversible, that can stop surge storm, that also somehow can replicate the shape of a trash boom. So we came up with this. This is a floating barrier with only 30 centimeters of net underneath, so it does not connect all the way to the ground. Anchored at 50-meter intervals along the entire path. I'm not going to talk about the shape for a second because I want you to see something else first. In testing, the image you see to the left is actually during calm waters. You can almost see no impacts on the structure of waves. So basically, when the weather is good, when there is no high wind, when there are no issues, it's basically a floating barrier that does not impact waves. But what happens when you start having high wind, it actually becomes a lot more effective. The waves on the other side, the image on the right side, is during a storm. And notice how much calmer the water on the inside looks. So the right side would be open to the Gulf, and the inside would be open to the bay. And automatically, you break in all of the waves that are coming to the side. So no matter the storm, no matter the wind, you already have calmer waters coming to the side. So you notice that the shape is slightly different here. So we were looking at what resembled a few cups, and then here we see a straight line. The way it's designed is that during low tide, when it's kind of relaxed, the floating barrier relaxes a little bit, so it starts forming these C-shaped cups that act as catchers. So anything that comes across, it gets caught into the C shape because the boom is relaxed and it's extended. The anchors are where they are, so it just relaxes the boom. But during high tide, it starts rising up and it becomes a straight line. Because the current is northwest and the wind is northwest, it automatically starts moving all of the waste along the boom. So everything naturally moves with the current from the northern end of the city all the way to the south. And then it connects directly outside the archaeological site. We use the existing pier as a natural catcher, and we make sure that everything that is accumulated across the boom starts swimming slowly without human intervention all the way to that beach. Now, this strip of beachfront is actually in and of itself an accumulation of soil. So this used to be seawater. It's already been scanned, it's already been surveyed, it's already been excavated. It has no remnants in it whatsoever. It's open to exploitation. It's completely outside the archaeological site. And from there, you can do as many campaigns as you want. You can bring in as many equipment as you need. You're operating safely away from a very fragile site. You don't need to worry about losses of coins, shards, objects, stones. You can bring in machinery to actually take out a much larger load. You can bring in vehicles to start loading larger quantities. This is a project that is delivered, as I mentioned, since the installation of the boom, the amount collected in tons has increased by over 400%. Granted that this is just months of work, so this has only been active for a few months. It's already kind of exceeding our expectations in terms of what it's delivering for the site. But what I left out is that we planned for the plastic to be there because we thought of a way to use the plastic. Yes, plastic discarded, uncontrolled, is an enemy. A plastic that is in your hand, in a bag, that you can control is a free resource. So before I tell you what we're doing with the plastic, I just wanted to point out that all of the anchors that are placed at 50-meter intervals are actually artificial reefs. So they're perforated blocks that actually can be used by living seashells, by marine life freely, and they are an integrated part of the boom itself. The picture that you see is what we did with the plastic. The boardwalk, the shade, the signage, part of the railing is from recycled plastic. And this, the first component, the boardwalk itself, is about 2 kilometers long, can now take you throughout the entire city, can get to experience the archaeological site without impacting any of the components. This boardwalk is completely reversible. It's completely superficial, so you can expand it, you can remove it, and it would have 0 traces on the site. It exploited existing alleyways and streets in the village, and now you get to experience the site up front. And as part of what was mentioned in the last presentation, we made sure that we mentioned the story. So the signage actually explains what was wrong with the site before the boom, why the boom was installed, where it's installed, how it's working to service the site, and the fact that you're standing on wood and plastic composite that is made from the waste that used to kind of come to the site. Another byproduct that we did not plan for, but became a resource that we're working on a development program for, is seaweed. Obviously, that seaweed does not have a very pleasant smell. It was coming to the site with some of the dead carcasses, but it is now being evaluated in R&D for a fertilizer. So it's being combined with other resources to become fertilizer for the site itself near the visitor center where we have vegetation and plantation. So it's also going to be ingested back into the site. As a result of all of this, the project, the boardwalk, you see the entire boardwalk itself becomes a shelter, because it is superficial. It's not sitting on the ground. It's not embedded in the ground in any way or form. It's an elevated boardwalk. So number one, it becomes a shelter for animals. Number two, with the anchors, with the reefs that we've created in the bay, you've had marine life returning to the area. Once you have marine life, birds return to the area. So again, we started having both local birds and migratory birds kind of come back to the site. When you have birds, that means the lizards, the insects and lizards will try to take shelter. So the entire boardwalk became a house. So underneath the boardwalk, you get scorpions, horned vipers. We've seen hedgehog. That was the first time I've seen a wild hedgehog myself on site. By the way, as a disclaimer, I'm not sourcing any of the photos because I've taken them myself. So, but for me, the bees were the biggest story of change. To have a beehive in a site that has never, according to records of like maybe the past 40 years, never had bees. That means the ecosystem is thriving. And we're on the boardwalk itself. So it's not like somewhere within the city, whatever introduction that you have made to the site, made for the beehive to grow. Now we have consistently at least 3 beehives per year. So as a system, trying to create a balance between current operation, between heritage management, and between endowment of flora and fauna in the site was basically delivered in this project. And I did want to mention this. I know I'm not going to keep you any longer, but I did want to mention that this project was sitting on my desk for at least 4 years. Nobody believed in the project. Nobody thought that it would work. Ultimately, it kept getting pushed back or cut out of the budget, and it was executed through a partnership with a corporate social responsibility fund. This entire project cost $2 million. And the entire team that has worked on it is 4 people, including all of the diving, including supervision of installation. Everything that had to do with this project was done by 4 people. And at the moment, we think that it could be a solution that kind of can be incorporated as part of a wider management construct, something that can coexist with mangroves or maybe replace the mangroves when it works, where it works. But this is the first of its kind. It's a pilot. We're now scaling it across the country, not just in heritage sites, but across the country as a whole. And we honestly think that this could be something that is plugged back into research and development, and maybe we can see a trash boom 2.0. Thank you. I will conclude with that, and I will let you get back to the break. Thanks.
Thank you, Abdul Hatif. Thank you, Adam. Yes, and look at that. It's only 7:10, so we've done quite well to catch up. We have a reception at the back there, which includes food and drink, and I will not keep you any longer. Thanks again to our speakers, and enjoy the evening.